I want to speak to you quietly, plainly, without ornament. There comes a moment in life when the world you were leaning on simply falls away, and you find yourself standing alone, not because you failed, but because you finally opened your eyes. That moment, uncomfortable as it is the beginning of clarity. Let me ask you something, and I want you to truly consider it before answering. Have you ever felt more alone after understanding something deeply than you did before you knew it at all? If so, tell me in the comments, because that feeling is not a mistake, it is a sign. You see, loneliness is not merely the absence of people. That is a childish definition. Loneliness is the absence of illusion. When the stories you were told about how life is supposed to work no longer persuade you, when the comforting myths dissolve, you are left with a kind of naked awareness. And that awareness can feel isolating because most people are still clinging to the stories. Human beings are social creatures, yes, but we are also narrative creatures. We bond not just through presence, but through shared assumptions about success, morality, love, purpose, and identity. When you begin to see that many of these assumptions are fabricated, inherited, or unconsciously repeated, you step outside the shared dream. And stepping outside the dream means you are no longer fully at home inside the crowd. This is why clarity carries a price. When you see clearly, you cannot unsee. You cannot pretend with the same innocence. You cannot participate wholeheartedly in games you now recognize as games. And so, a subtle distance forms, not because you reject others, but because you no longer pretend alongside them. Now, let me be very clear. This is not a call to arrogance. Clarity does not make you superior. In fact, if it does, you have misunderstood it entirely. True seeing strips away superiority just as ruthlessly as it strips away false belonging. It shows you that everyone is playing a role, including the one you thought was you. Most loneliness is born from resistance. We resist not being understood. We resist not fitting in. We resist the discomfort of standing in our own awareness without the reassurance of agreement. But when you stop resisting, something curious happens. The loneliness changes its character. It stops being a wound and becomes a space. I often observe that people are terrified of being alone with themselves. They fill silence with noise, time with busyness, and consciousness with distraction. Not because these things are evil, but because stillness reveals too much. Stillness shows you that the self you've been defending is not as solid as you imagined, and that realization can feel like falling through the floor. But falling is not failure. Falling is what happens when there is no longer ground beneath an illusion, and in that fall, there is freedom, though it rarely feels like freedom at first. It feels like loss. Loss of certainty. Loss of belonging. Loss of identity. Consider this carefully. Society rewards conformity far more than truth. It always has. To see clearly is to see where the rewards are placed, and to recognize that they are often bait. Approval, status, validation, these are currencies within the dream. When you no longer value them as you once did, you may find yourself impoverished in the eyes of the world, yet strangely rich in understanding. This is why those who awaken even slightly often feel estranged. They still love people, but they no longer need the same agreements. They still participate, but with a lightness, knowing the rules are provisional, and that lightness can be misunderstood as detachment, coldness, or even loneliness. Yet the deepest irony is this: the loneliness you feel when you see clearly is not separation from others, it is separation from false connection. It is the absence of pretending. And pretending, however comforting, is always exhausting. I invite you now to notice something in your own life. Where have you felt most alone? Was it truly when you were without people, or was it when you were surrounded by people who could not meet you where you actually were? Reflect on that, because it reveals the difference between solitude and isolation. Solitude is chosen. Isolation is imposed. Seeing clearly often begins as isolation but matures into solitude. At first you feel cut off. Later you realize you are simply no longer crowded inside. When you begin to accept this companionship between clarity and loneliness, something in you relaxes. You stop treating loneliness as a symptom to be cured and start recognizing it as a signal to be listened to. Signals are not punishments, they are messages. And this particular message is telling you that you are no longer asleep in the same way you once were. You see, most human interaction is not communion, it is mutual reassurance. We reassure one another that our fears are justified, that our ambitions make sense, that our identities are solid. We say, "Yes, I see the world the way you do," and in that agreement we feel safe. But clarity interrupts this transaction. It says, what if the way we are seeing is partial? What if it is conditioned? What if it is not the truth, but merely a habit? And habits do not like to be questioned. So when you stop participating fully in this mutual reassurance, people may feel uneasy around you, not because you are wrong, but because you are no longer predictable. You are no longer echoing, and the absence of echo feels, to the conditioned mind, like rejection. This is where many people retreat. They sense the loneliness creeping in and decide, consciously or unconsciously, to trade clarity for comfort. They dull their insight just enough to belong again. They laugh at jokes they no longer find funny. They chase goals they no longer believe in. They adopt opinions they no longer feel. And from the outside, they look connected, but inwardly they are divided. I am not condemning this. I understand it. Belonging is a powerful instinct, but I want you to see the cost. The cost is that quiet, persistent ache of self-betrayal, the feeling that you are present everywhere except where you actually are. Clarity, on the other hand, asks something radical of you. It asks you to stand without armor, without labels, without rehearsed answers. It asks you to be honest even when honesty does not win applause. And yes, this can be lonely, because the world is loud and clarity is subtle. But here is the crucial point most people miss. Loneliness, born of clarity, is not empty. It is spacious. It is the space in which real perception arises. When you are no longer rushing to fill silence with agreement, you begin to hear what is actually happening within you and around you. You notice how often people speak not to communicate, but to defend. You notice how much of your own past speech was the same. You notice how identities are performed rather than lived. And you notice, perhaps with some amusement, how seriously everyone takes the play. This noticing does not require withdrawal from life. On the contrary, it allows deeper participation, but without attachment to outcome. You can love without possession. You can listen without needing to convince. You can speak without needing to win. At this stage, loneliness transforms again. It becomes a kind of neutrality. You are no longer lonely in the sense of lacking connection. You are simply no longer dependent on constant validation. And that independence feels strange at first, because we were trained to equate dependence with love. But love does not require constant agreement. Love requires presence, and presence is something you can only offer when you are not desperately trying to secure yourself through others. Think about this carefully. The fear of loneliness is often the fear of being nothing. But what if being nothing, no fixed role, no defended identity, no rigid story, is precisely what allows you to be everything you are? What if the self you are protecting is the very thing obscuring your freedom? When you see this, you stop asking, how do I get rid of loneliness? And start asking, what is loneliness showing me? And that shift in question changes the entire experience. You begin to see that loneliness is not pushing you away from the world. It is inviting you into a more honest relationship with it, one that does not depend on performance, one that does not require pretense, one that is quiet enough to be real. And yes, this path is not crowded. It never has been. Truth is not popular because it cannot be standardized. It cannot be mass-produced. It must be discovered directly, and discovery is always a solitary act. But solitary does not mean hopeless. It means unmediated. It means you are meeting life without a middleman. Now we come to the quiet revelation that waits at the far end of this loneliness. And I say far end, not because it is distant in time, but because it is distant from resistance. When you stop fighting loneliness, when you stop trying to fix it, explain it away, or drown it out, it reveals its final secret. The secret is this: you were never actually separated. What felt like isolation was the collapse of a false center. The sense of being me versus the world loosens, and in its place appears something far more intimate and far more unsettling, the realization that the boundary you thought defined you was always conceptual, useful perhaps, but imagined. Most people feel lonely because they believe they are fragments trying to connect, separate selves, reaching outward. But clarity shows you that this sense of separation is a mental habit, not an ultimate fact. And when that habit weakens, loneliness loses its foundation. You are no longer trying to be understood. You are no longer trying to be approved of. You are no longer trying to be held together by agreement. You simply are. And in that simplicity, there is an ease that no amount of social connection can provide. This does not mean you stop relating to others. In fact, your relationships become cleaner. You no longer need people to complete you, rescue you, or confirm you. You meet them where they are, not where you need them to be. And paradoxically, this is when real intimacy becomes possible, because now you are not using others to escape yourself. This is why those who see clearly can sit alone without despair. Silence is no longer an enemy. Stillness is no longer threatening. There is nothing missing that needs to be supplied by noise or distraction. The mind relaxes its grip, and life flows through without obstruction. And when you do engage with others from this place, there is a lightness, a playfulness. You know the roles are roles. You know the words are symbols. You know the disagreements are not wars, but misunderstandings between stories. And so you listen more, you react less, you laugh more easily. This is the loneliness that no longer feels like loneliness at all. It feels like being at home everywhere without needing to own the house. I want you to notice something subtle in your own experience. When you stop trying to belong, do people actually move farther away, or do they relax? Often, it is our grasping that creates distance, our neediness that creates walls. When that dissolves, connection happens naturally, without effort. Clarity does not make you cold. It makes you spacious, and space is what allows warmth to circulate without burning. So, if you are feeling lonely right now, do not rush to label it as a problem. Do not assume something has gone wrong. Ask instead, what illusion has loosened its grip? What story no longer convinces me? What identity is quietly dissolving? Because the pain you feel may not be loss. It may be withdrawal from something that was never truly nourishing. Loneliness is the price of seeing clearly, yes, but it is a price you only pay once. After that, what remains is not isolation, but freedom. Not separation, but intimacy without attachment. Not confusion, but a gentle, steady understanding that you are not standing outside of life, you are what is happening. And when you see that, truly see it, you will discover that you were never alone at all.